All right. So we're all set to go?
All set.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. That was overly nice. Particularly, my wife enjoyed the promo for this podcast where it said the great Alan Christenson, and she knows better. So I'm afraid that the great Alan Christenson couldn't show up, and you're left with the much lesser Alan Christenson tonight. So it was very kind of Jim to invite me to do the talk tonight, and it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. As Jim mentions, I've been working in Guatemala since 1976 and just dearly love the place and dearly love the literature and everything about it. So this is a pure joy for me to talk about Popol Vuh tonight. So I understand that most of you probably are very familiar with the Maya, but not necessarily everyone. So just know that this is one of the world's great peoples. They go back thousands of years, amazing architecture, amazing sculpture. They have a writing system that dates back at least 2,500 years, which is complicated and beautiful in its complexity. But I thought that I would give you one of the major advances that the Maya have given to us, and that is cacao. Cacao is one of the great gifts that the Maya gave to us. And what would the world be like? And the Popol Vuh does mention cacao. So here's a first quote that we have from the Popol Vuh. This is from the creation account when they discover the maize that's going to be used to create human beings. And the text says, "Thus they rejoiced over the discovery of that excellent mountain that was filled with delicious things, crowded with yellow ears of maize and white ears of maize. It was crowded as well with pataste and cacao, with countless zapotes and anonas, with jocotes and nances, with matasanos and honey. From within the first mountain came the most delicious foods in the citadel. All the small foods and the great foods were there." And you can see that there was a slight emphasis added to cacao. So if you've ever used the word cacao, you've already been speaking Maya. That's directly a Maya word. If you prefer chocolate, that comes from Nahuatl, Central Mexican language of the Aztecs. They pronounce it chocolat, but it's chocolate. So thank you, Maya. Okay, so let's talk about the Popol Vuh a bit. So as I mentioned before, the Maya have had literacy for more than 2,000 years. And there was originally a text in the Precolumbian Quiche kingdom that was called the Popol Vuh. The correct pronunciation would be Popol Vuh, but very few people can pronounce that. So Popol Vuh is fine. So this is from the text mentioning that ancient version of the book. And it says, "They saw if there would be death, if there would be hunger. They surely knew if there would be strife. There was an instrument of sight. There was a book. Popol Vuh was their name for it." So from this description of the text, the original ancient text, Precolumbian text, it sounds like a divinatory almanac that would be used to divine auguries for particular days, to set important ceremonial times, timing war, timing other kinds of things. And this is similar to the kind of divinatory text that we see from the lowlands, like the Dresden Codex or the Madrid or the Paris, maybe even possibly the Grolier. So sadly, we don't have access to that original Precolumbian text. The authors of the Popol Vuh were surviving members of the Quiche nobility in the western highlands of Guatemala. And in sometime between 1554 and 1558, they compiled what we know today as the Popol Vuh. And this is their description of what their attempt was. And it reads, "This is the beginning of the ancient traditions of this place called Quiche. Here we shall write. We shall begin to tell the ancient stories of the beginning, the origin of all that was done. We shall bring it forth because there is no longer the means whereby the Popol Vuh may be seen. The original book exists that was written anciently, but its witnesses and those who ponder it hide their faces." So this is a fascinating text passage. It does claim very straightforward that the original Precolumbian text existed and that they had access to it. but that the witnesses and those who ponder it hide their faces. So they're the ones in hiding. And sadly, in the immediate years after the Spanish conquest, texts like the Popol Vuh were targeted for destruction. Many hundreds, if not thousands of books throughout the Maya world were destroyed, burned very publicly. And even those that knew how to read and write, if they continued to preserve ancient texts or continued to write according to the ancient traditions, they were persecuted and even executed. So it's no wonder that they're in hiding. This, unlike other texts, the title of the Nichaib or the Tamub or the Totonicapán, there are actually quite a number of texts that were written in that 16th century period, and the vast majority of them are duly signed as legal documents. And the Popol Vuh is rather anomalous in the fact that it isn't signed. There are no names mentioned, and that's probably because the contents of this book would have been anathema to the Spanish and ecclesiastical authorities and even the secular authorities. So it was a dangerous thing to have written this book, and that tells us something about the motivation of them, that they were desperate to preserve as much as they could of the ancient text. Now, as far as we know, in the highlands, there were never any hieroglyphic texts composed. And the Popol Vuh never claims that the Quiches themselves composed the book. They said that they brought it from the east where the sun rises. And the likelihood is that it was brought from the lowlands where literacy in hieroglyphic texts was certainly common. So we think that probably sometime in the early 13th century, the Quiche, at least one Quiche migration brought in what they're calling the Popol Vuh, and they probably knew enough about it to be able to do divination ceremonies based on it. So between 1554 and 1558, a group of Maya nobility, in some way based on the earlier book, wrote a much larger account that includes, no doubt, oral traditions and other elements, and wrote that down in a very flowing, beautiful longhand. Sadly, we don't have that 1554 version either. It probably looks something like what you see on the screen on the right. It's written in a modified Latin script, but it is pure Maya. And the one that you see there is the Titulo Coyoy, which is also composed in the 16th century. So we sadly don't have that earlier version. What we do have is what you see on the left. In 1701, there was a Dominican priest named Francisco Jimenez, who was the parish priest of Chichicastenango in Guatemalan highlands at the time. And he came to find that there were a number of old documents and manuscripts, including the Popol Vuh. And somehow he ingratiated himself with the locals, and they allowed him to borrow that 1554 version and make a copy. And so the earliest copy that we have available to us is Jimenez's copy of that text. And what you see, it's written in two columns. On the left-hand side is the original Latin alphabet Quiche text. And on the right-hand side is a rather flowery Spanish translation that Jimenez made. Today, this is in, of all places, Chicago at the Newberry Library. It's a private library in Chicago. And all translations that we have today in numerous languages are based on this copy that Jimenez made. We don't know what happened to the 16th century manuscript. Presumably he returned it to the Quiches. And there's some pretty good evidence that we can't talk about that probably it still exists. But nobody outside the Quiche caretakers have seen that particular version. Okay, so with that rather complicated background on it, this is a commentary that Francisco Jimenez made about not just the Popol Vuh, but the fact that there were other texts. He wrote, "It was with great reserve that these manuscripts were kept among them, with such secrecy that the ancient ministers did not know of it. In investigating this point, while I was in the parish of Santo Tomas, Chichicastenango, I found that it was the doctrine which they first imbibed with their mother's milk, and that all of them knew it almost by heart. And I found that they had many of these books among them. We just wish he had copied more than the one. It wouldn't have been nice to have several of these manuscripts copied down and available for translation. But we don't. We have the one. And we're very grateful to have the Popol Vuh. It's almost accidental that we have this magnificent text. So this is the part of the monastery complex at Chichicastenango, and it dates back to the early 18th century. So Jimenez would have known these rooms very well. And apparently we don't know which one, but in one of these rooms, Jimenez made his copy of the Popol Vuh. Okay, so with that, let's just move on to the text. And as Jim had mentioned, the purpose of the creation, the purpose of this talk tonight is about the underlying Maya theology that goes into the way that the Quiches looked at creation in particular. And much of the first section of the Popol Vuh is all about creation. For the Maya, the gods are not infallible, and they're also not all powerful and immortal. They go through similar phases of birth, maturation, and death as everything else in life has. And so what they require is a mediator to be able to stand as a transition between the world of the sacred and this world, and to be able, through ceremonies, through prayers, through offerings, to be able to periodically rebirth the world, including the gods and all of the sacred elements of the world that we know. And virtually all major Quiche ceremonies, even today, have their foundation in some element of creation and rebirthing the world. So let's go through the text and see how that works. This is from the first page of the creation section. And the authors write, "These then are the first words, the first speech. There is not yet one person, one animal, bird, fish, crab, tree, rock, hollow, canyon, meadow, or forest. All alone the sky exists. The face of the earth has not yet appeared. Alone lies the expanse of the sea along with the womb of all the sky. There is not yet anything gathered together. All is at rest, nothing stirs. All is languid, at rest in the sky. There is not then anything that exists. Only the expanse of the water, only the tranquil sea lies alone. There is not then anything that might exist, for all lies placid and quiet in the darkness, in the night." So a couple of things that are interesting about that. Well, a lot of things are interesting about it, but one of the things that stands out is that it's not written in past tense, as if this is something that happened a long time ago and is now done. It's written in a present progressive tense, which is a grammatic form that doesn't really exist in modern Quiche, but you see it all through the 16th century texts. And what's interesting about that is that the idea that as you're reading this, you're not to picture yourself reading something from the far gone, long ago past. It's a continuing process. And this is characteristic of modern Quiche storytelling as well. When I first started working in little tiny cantones and aldeas around Momostenango back in the 1970s, there was no electricity, and candles and much less oil lamps. They were very expensive, and oftentimes people would just forego it, which means that when the sun goes down and it gets dark, you eat, and then you have a lot of time on your hands before you get sleepy enough to go to bed. And so what they would do is they would tell stories. And for the most part, stories had to do with, what mom and dad, what the world was like when mom and dad were young, or even better, grandma and grandpa. Or they like to tell funny stories about talking animals. If you've ever spent any time in Quiche areas, you'll know that their jokes are all about talking animals. A lot of times they're hard to figure out what's funny about them, but if a coyote says something and a rabbit responds, it's hilarious no matter what they say. But there are times when they do serious stories. And one of the major tales is the story of creation. And when it's something major like this, it's usually told by either the matriarch of the family, the oldest woman, or the oldest man. And before telling stories of that kind of importance, they usually use the phrase, let us spend this night with the ancients. And they mean that literally. When you describe creation or the very beginning of things, you use this present progressive tense. And the conception is that time folds back on itself so that you're actually not in the 20th or the 21st century. You are there present at that moment of creation, and you're reliving that. And this is a very real thing for them. They're very careful about saying the names of deities, for example, or the names of ancestors, because once you say something, they believe you bring that entity to be manifest in physical ways. So they're very, very careful about that. And when you describe the creation of the world, it's as if you're rebirthing the world as you do it. Words have power. So in Maya theology, just as in the lowlands, in the highlands, they also believed that the world was at the beginning of time in complete darkness, that there was a primordial sea that covered everything. And then out of that primordial sea rose three mountains or volcanoes or stones. And anything that has a reminiscence of that kind of sacred geography gets them very excited. Many of you probably recognize Lake Atitlan here. I'm standing on the shore near Panajachel, looking across the lake towards the bay that Santiago Atitlan is located on, which is one of the major ceremonial centers for the lake region. And you can see that there are three volcanoes, and where the three volcanoes come together is a bay, and that's where the ancient capital of the Tz'utujils and where Santiago Atitlan is located today. Even today, they refer to that area as Shemushushchap, Shemushushleo, Shemushushkach. This is the navel of the rain, navel of the sky, navel of the earth. It is the center of all creation. And I'm sure the first Maya that came across this spot probably passed out when they came to. They knew that this was a very, very powerful center. So this is the way they describe creation. Next passage reads, all alone are the framer and the shaper, sovereign and Quetzal serpent, they who have borne children and they who have begotten sons. Luminous they are in the water, wrapped in Quetzal feathers and Cotinga feathers. So let's pick these apart. The word that I translate as framer here is tzapol. And the root for tzapol is tzak, which means to build something. And that could be anything that has parts that you put together and to make a whole. So if you're building a house, you gather the adobe and the thatch and the wood for the framing and the door, and you put those together. Well, that act in Quiche is tzak, to build or to frame or to put together. So the very first creator deity that's mentioned is that framer. But the other word is shaper, and that has the root beat. Bitol is shaper, and the root is beat. Beat is the other way that you make things. So rather than putting things together from component parts, beat is to take an amorphous substance and give it shape. Like if you're going to make a clay vessel, as you see in the photograph here, you take a lump of clay, you shape it, you form it, and you make sure that it is in the proper shape for it, and then you fire it. That is to beat something. So what they're telling you, and you see it throughout the text, is that it's made up of parallel couplets. You use two words to describe a much larger concept. So if you want to say the surface of the world in Quiche, you say the mountains and the plains. If you want to say all animals that live in the forest, then you say deer and jaguar, because those two represent all wild animals for them. They didn't have too many domestic animals in the pre-Columbian world, so the couplet they use for that is turkeys and dogs. But if you say turkeys and dogs, it means all domesticated animals. So what they're doing here is they're telling you the two kinds of creation, when put together, describes all creation, which is, I think, a really fascinating way of doing things. Also, I could mention here that in Quiche, if there's a female and a male couplet, the female always comes first. This is also true in processions. If you've seen ceremonial processions in traditional places like Momostenango or Chichicastenango or Santiago Atitlan, women always are at the forefront of those processions. And a good friend of mine, a traditional priest, said, well, that's because only women can create life. And so therefore, female always comes before male in couplets. It's likely that Popol is the female aspect of this because only women can put together the bones and the skin and the musculature of a baby forming in the womb. Whereas the male component of that is giving it a certain shape and appearance so that the child looks somewhat like the father. So one of the gods that was mentioned is Quetzal serpent, which in Quiche is Pukumats. And here is a version of a feathered serpent deity. This one's in the Louvre in Paris. And it was made by the Mexica, but a very simple, very similar concept. So moving on, the next passage says, then came his word, heart of sky arrived here with sovereign and Quetzal serpent in the darkness, in the night. He spoke with sovereign and Quetzal serpent. They talked together then. They thought and they pondered. They reached an accord, bringing together their words and their thoughts. So this is in Santiago Atitlan, where I do quite a bit of research lately. This is a cofradia house. And cofradia houses are where the traditional ceremonies take place. And you can see there are sacred images in the background. These are the elders of that particular cofradia. Whenever there is a major ceremony or an offering or a procession or some kind of sacred observance, the participants all get together and they meet in the cofradia house. And the first time I was invited to one of these, I was really excited. I had been working in Quiche areas for decades, but this was new for me in the early 1990s for Santiago Atitlan. And I felt very honored to be invited to participate in the planning for a fairly major ceremony. And I was kind of surprised because I was thinking that they were going to be planning the procession and making assignments. And they didn't really. They just got together and they talked and they laughed and they drank and they ate and they enjoyed one another's company. And after about 8 hours of that, they all bid their goodbyes and left. And I asked the head of the cofradia, I said, when are you going to plan the ceremony? And he says, well, we do the same thing every year. We don't have to plan it. What this was for, and the phrase that he used was to bring together our hearts and minds, which is an exact quote from the Popol Vuh. In their way of looking at the world, you can't participate in a ceremony, particularly a creation ceremony, unless your heart is pure. The way they say it is Sakmukush or Sakwanima, my heart is pure. If you are going to do a ceremony and you have had an argument with your wife or your neighbor, or you've yelled at your children or whatever, then they would say that your heart is either red or it's black, depending on how serious it was. No one would ask you any questions, but if you show up at the procession, that person would say, well, I can't participate in the ceremony today. No one will question them. No one will criticize them or ask them why. They just understand that your heart isn't right. And this is something that we see throughout the Popol Vuh, is that your heart has to be pure for the world to come out pure. So it's really kind of a beautiful way of looking at the world. And I'm frozen on this page. There we go. So the next passage reads, then they gave birth, heartening one another. The light went forth. They gave birth to humanity. Thus they arranged for the creation of the trees and the bushes, the provision of all life and humanity in the darkness and in the night, by Heart of Sky, who is called Huracan. So the whole idea of this is that they're not creating something out of nothing. They're giving it birth. They see time as cyclic, as most Maya time is seen as both cyclic and linear. but things return back to their original form during these ceremonies so that they can be rebirthed. So here's a nice rollout photograph by Justin Kerr of the Vase of the Seven Gods. And many of you are familiar with this piece. This vessel shows the moment before creation. You can see the black background. It's at night. There is no light. The only light that emanates out of that darkness are the deities themselves, and there are 7 of them. That's why they came up with the very creative and brilliant name, Vase of Seven Gods. And right here, I don't know if you can see the arrow, but I'm pointing towards the day of creation. So they're letting you know, the artist of this particular vessel is letting you know that this is that moment of creation when the world is going to come out of that darkness and that chaos. So the next passage, all then was measured and staked out into 4 divisions, doubling over and stretching the measuring cords of the womb of sky and the womb of earth. Thus were established the 4 corners, the 4 sides, as it is said, by the framer and the shaper, the mother and the father of life and all creation. So the way they're describing it is like laying out a maize field. And there are references to the cultivation of maize all through the Popol Vuh. Like humanity itself is eventually going to be created out of maize flesh. So here is a nice series of fields in the hills above Totonicapán, not terribly far from the Pan American Highway. And you can see how each one of these fields is laid out with 4 corners and 4 sides, just as the authors of the Popol Vuh were describing the gods laying out a cultivated field in the form of the world. And this is also true of major ceremonies. For major ceremonies, the Akhihab, which means something like day of the sun or day of the day. Sometimes you can refer to them as shamans or traditional priests. I wish we had a good English equivalent of what Akhihab means. But nevertheless, an Akhih is a ritual specialist. And for major ceremonies, you can see that they lay out a layer of pine needles. Evergreens represent eternity, a lack of death because they don't turn brown in the dry season. And in the midst of that, he's laid out a cosmogram of candles with 4 groups of candles pointing towards the 4 cardinal directions and 1 vertical group of candles to mark the center point. Generally, these would be laid out according to the colors for the cardinal directions, red for east, black for west, white for north, and yellow for south. The center point would be a green-blue, which is the same color in all Maya languages. Green and blue are just seen as shades of the same color. But in this case, this was a petition ceremony for this gentleman, and I was part of the group. We were going to go into a sacred cave, and this is one of those places where you have to ask permission of the ancestors to do that. So we used all white candles because we were hoping to have a unity of hearts and that we would all be pure, which in Quiche is sak, which means pure, white, clear, all those things. Okay, one interesting thing is that the Quiches look at the world as being dependent on human beings, at least cultivated world. There's the wild world as well. And the Popol Vuh does have a section that kind of contrasts the jungle area, the wild, untamed nature, and what they're hoping that human beings will be able to do, which is to cultivate maize and bring orderly life or cultured life into the world. So this is from a passage where 2 deity twins plant the first known maize field. And they were called, we refer to them as the hero twins. And the text says, then they, the hero twins, began again to accomplish their deeds, to manifest themselves before the face of their grandmother and before the face of their mother. First, they worked the maize field. As for the axe, they just stuck it into the fork of a tree, and by its own strength it would fell it. Thus the one axe chopped and felled all the trees and bushes, feverishly working to cut down the trees all by itself. Now this, the hoe, would break up countless stalks and briars, Just the one hoe would clear countless mountains, both small and great, as it went. So this is great. And number one, they don't even have to work. They just have these magical instruments. They have power, so they just stick the axe in there and it does all the work. Stick the hoe in there, it does all the work. But it doesn't remain that way. On the second day, they arrived at the maize field, hoping, I assume that they hoped to see their nice plot of maize field all ready to be planted with maize. But instead, it says on the second day, they arrived at the maize field to find that all the trees and bushes had been raised up again. All the stalks and briars had again fastened themselves together. Who was playing tricks on us, they asked, therefore. Now it was all the animals, both great and small, that had done it. The puma and the jaguar, the deer and the rabbit, the fox and the coyote, the peccary and the coati, the small birds and the great birds, these had done it. In a single night they did it. Here's a very nice, another rollout photo from Justin Kerr's archive. They just make the cutest animals ever. Look at that. You've got the armadillo there playing an upright drum on the left, followed by a rabbit, followed by a deer, and then a jaguar, then a puma, and then probably a rat, probably a coatimundi after that. So it's showing you all of these wild animals. They're the ones that do it. Anybody that's tried to do any kind of cultivation in Guatemala knows that if you leave it for a day or two, it starts to be overgrown. Everything grows and grows fast. So this is kind of an explanation of why that is. So the text ends with, someone perhaps has been playing tricks on us, our grandmother. When we arrived a while ago at our maize field, we found that it had become a great field of grass and a great forest once again, they said to their grandmother and their mother. Therefore, we shall go back and watch over it by night, for it is not good what has been done to us. Thus they concealed themselves. They went out again to cut down the trees, and then they hid themselves there, taking cover. At length, all the animals gathered together, coming together as one. All the small and great animals arrived in the very heart of the night, chattering as they came. And this was their speech. Arise, trees, arise, bushes, they said when they came. Thus they congregated beneath the trees and the bushes, emerging where they could be seen before their faces. So I won't read the rest of it, but basically they tried to catch the wild animals and stop them from doing it, and weren't able to do it because they leapt away or they were slippery. They couldn't grab anything. The only one that they were able to catch was a rat. But this explains, to your average Maya farmer, well, it's not just the fact that things grow spontaneously. There must be some involvement there, and they ascribe it to the wild animals putting everything back together. Okay, so on the cultivated side, though, is maize. And for the Maya, maize is not just a staple crop for them. You have to eat it every meal if you're a traditionalist. This is literally human flesh. We tend to look at the cobs of corn as ears of corn. They don't. They refer to them as heads of maize. And they do kind of resemble human bodies. The corn silk and flour up the top of the plant is the hair of the maize. The leaves are the arms of the maize. The ears are the heads of the maize. And the roots are the legs of the maize. And they really do imprint themselves onto that. You can see on this image drawing from the tablet of the foliated cross at Palenque that nestled within the beautiful leaves of the maize plant are little heads of the maize god. You can see one there and another one there. So literally maize is a sacred thing. It is a god. Here's a nice vessel. It's currently in the Art Institute of Chicago, and it shows the maize god dancing the world into creation. Here's, again, I can't tell whether you can see my arrow or not, but here's the face of the maize god facing to the left. There's one arm, there's another arm, and two legs. He's dancing. And all of this behind him on his back is the stuff from which the universe is going to be made. So he's literally dancing the world into creation. Here's another image of the maize god being reborn with his twin sons on either side, Hunahau on the left and Yashbalam on the right. These are analogous to the hero twins that I just talked to you about from the Popol Vuh. And here's the great mystery. The sons are helping the father to be reborn. And eventually the father is going to give birth to the son. So it's an eternal cycle that repeats itself. And in agricultural terms, of course, the maize seed grows and becomes a beautiful head of maize on the plant, but eventually it will die. And the little seeds in Quiche are referred to as bak or cholom, which is a skull. These are little skulls. And eventually you will take that little skull, you'll plant it in the planting season, and it will be reborn again. So the father becomes the son becomes the father, endless cycles over and over and over again. So from the text, it says, how shall it be sown? How shall there be a dawn for anyone? Who shall be a provider? Who shall be a sustainer? So the first part of that couplet, how shall it be sown? We've already kind of mentioned this, that the Maya see human beings and maize as inextricably interconnected, that they are woven into the fabric of one another. You can't have one with another. Maize, there's no such thing as wild maize. It's a completely domesticated crop. If human beings don't plant maize, there won't be any maize next year because it's evolved in such a way that it has a thick covering over the seeds and the seeds can't get out. So human beings have to plant the maize, they have to cultivate it, they have to tend it, they have to prop it up with little hills of dirt so that it won't topple over. It's a very time-consuming job to raise maize. Fortunately, they love to do it. So when it says, how shall it be sown, you can look at that in terms of sowing maize. But also what's interesting is the Maya don't really have word for sex. They're very prudish in that way. In fact, they never have. There's no word for sex in the Popol Vuh, even though they talk about sex. One of the major ways of saying sex is that the man sows the woman. The other idea is that when a child is born, the parents will give the afterbirth to an apir, a ritual specialist, who will take it to a lineage shrine up in the mountain and bury it in the ground with in an area that's designated for that family, called a lineage shrine. And the verb that they use for planting that umbilical cord and placenta in the lineage shrine is to sow the child. So yeah, it's connected with that. The other side of that is, how shall there be a dawn for anyone? So dawn, obviously, this is the rising of the sun in the east, but it's also the word that the Maya use for giving birth. Child dawns. It's kind of cute when a child is really young, like these, well, at least the one in the middle. Oftentimes they don't refer to it with a given name. They refer to it as a little sun, S-U-N, and that little sun has just recently dawned. So they use the same verbs for world creation as they do for creation of a child or a human being on a small scale. The other part of that was who shall be a provider, apol, and who shall be a sustainer, pol. These are words that are used generally for a woman who cares for and nurtures a child. So the gods are saying, who's going to be a provider and a sustainer for us? Who is going to be able to perpetuate the world? And probably more importantly for them, who's going to rebirth us when it comes time for us to die and we need to be rebirthed and sustained. So the gods are using verbs that normally would be used for a mother caring for an infant, nourishing an infant. So this is the way that the gods saw human beings. Eventually, when they create them, that they are going to be the caregivers for deity and the world of the sacred. Back to the text. Then were conceived the animals of the mountains, the guardians of the forest, and all that populate the mountains, the deer and the birds, the puma and the jaguar, the serpent and the rattlesnake, the pit viper and the guardian of the bushes. So basically, the gods are not infallible. They make several attempts to create human beings that would function as mediators and sustainers and providers. And the first attempt they made was the animals. And there's a cute little brocket deer. So you know what a deer looks like in Guatemala anyway. And the first thing that after they've created the animals was the gods told them, speak, call, don't moan or cry out. Speak to one another, each according to your kind, according to your group. It was said to the deer, the birds, the pumas, the jaguars, and the serpents. Speak therefore our names, worship us, for we are your mother and your father. But they could not speak like people. They only squawked and chattered and roared. Their speech was unrecognizable, for each cried out in a different way. Seems odd that the first thing that the creator deities would want their new creations to do would be to pronounce their names. But that goes back to that idea that words have power. If you can pronounce the name of a god, you're basically giving it physical manifestation. You're rebirthing that deity. But they weren't able to. They just squawked and chattered and roared. They weren't able to speak the names of the gods. So the text says that's why we eat them. And that's kind of the end of the animals as far as being mediators. So here you have a nice little vessel, Cur 808, showing the results of a deer hunt. So they try it again as the second attempt at creation. And it says, then was the making, the doing of it, of earth and mud was its flesh composed. But they saw that it was still not good. It merely came undone and crumbled. It merely became sodden and soft. It merely fell apart and dissolved. Its head was not set properly in place, so that its face could not move. Its face was hidden. Neither could it look about. At first it spoke, but without knowledge. Straightway it dissolved in water, for it was not strong. There are a number of really fascinating things here. First one is the idea of face. In Quiche, there are two words for face. One is palach, and palach is just the front of your head. That's where your eyes and nose and mouth and all that's just the physical face. But the other is wach, and wach is more like your essential being. It's usually translated as face because we don't really have a good equivalent name for it. But that's more what it is. It's your countenance or your essential being. So when it says that its face was hidden, this is not good. In Quiche society, the most common greeting that you have when you're passing somebody on a trail or on a road is la utzawach, which means is your face good? And it's using that term wach, not pala, wach. And the response is utznawach. Yes, my face is good. Wach is used for all kinds of important phrases. For example, if I don't like something, I would say that it falls badly on my face. If you want to say that a person is ugly, you say that their face is painful to my face. And you can go on and on and on. There are all kinds of phrases for it. When I was doing the translation for this, I had a few friends that were akhab, and sometimes I would kind of bounce ideas off of them. And I read the text, the original Quiche text, to where it says that its face was hidden. And one of them actually gasped. That is the worst insult that you could possibly say to someone. They do use that phrase. Well, what that means is that you're essentially a false person, that there is no truth to you. You are completely deceiving. You don't show your true self to anyone. So this is a very powerful thing to say about the mud person. The other is that the head was not set properly in place so that its face could not move, neither could it look about. This is also a phrase that they use in Quiche today. If you describe a person as only being able to look forward and not turn their head, that means, I guess in our parlance, it's close to that. They're stiff-necked, or they can only see things from one perspective. Closed-minded, I think, is probably a good way of looking at it. And the final part, at first it spoke, but without knowledge. So it can speak, it can say words, but there's no knowledge behind it. So this is a failed creation, and it fell apart anyway. So that's the end of the mud person. This has probably nothing to do with Popol Vuh, but it is a terracotta figure, so you can see what a mud person might be conceived of. So the third try to create human beings was made out of wood, and this would be dry wood. The text says, may we be called upon, and may we be remembered, for it is with words that we are sustained. Thus may it be spoken. And look how it says that. That's an interesting phrase. For it is with words that we are sustained. And the word for that is and it's to be nourished, cared for, taken care of. Thus may it be spoken, may it be sown, may it dawn, so that we are called upon and supported, so that we are remembered by framed and shaped people, by effigies and forms of people. Hearken and let it be so. And when they had spoken, straightway the images of wood were made. They had the appearance of people and spoke like people as well. They populated the whole face of the earth. The images carved of wood began to multiply, bearing daughters and sons. Nevertheless, they still did not possess their hearts nor their minds. They did not remember their framer or their shaper. So here is, many of you probably seen that. Did I hear someone was actually there at the Lake Atitlan area? You can't respond, but I think I heard someone was there. So I'm sure that they recognize the famous Trilach Mam, also known as Mashimon. This is a wood figure. And as much as he's venerated, and he is venerated very, very seriously in Santiago Atitlan as one of their major deiforms, they would say that he doesn't really have memory. He lives in the moment. He doesn't consider the way that things have always been done ancestrally because he has no memory of that. And they would say it's a function of the fact that he's made of wood, and dry wood at that. And the reason for that is that we tend to think in our Western culture that memory is a function of the brain. They don't. The seat of memory for the Quiches and Tzutuvils, people that live in Santiago Atitlan, they believe that memory is a function of blood. And you carry the blood of all of your ancestors, and therefore, under certain ceremonial conditions, in the right time and the right place, you can call forth those ancestors and their memories, so that you literally call back the ancient past and the ancient memories of the ancestors. This is why when you apprentice to become an apich, which I did in Momostenango, it's a 9-month process. You go through a lot of work during those 9 months, and at the end of the 9 months, it's like the human gestation period, you're considered to be reborn. Well, sadly, I don't have ancestors that know Maya ceremonies or prayers or all this ancient knowledge. So they actually felt kind of sorry for me in Momostenango because I had to memorize the ceremonies and prayers. They always said, nah, I just have to learn how to remember. And this is the way that they look at being able to carry on traditions in as accurate and as close to the original as possible, because they have those ancestral memories within their blood. So the word to remember, it's very short in Quiche, it's na. So a little glottal there at the end, it's not an apostrophe, it's a glottal mark. Just means that you say the letter and you cut it off really quickly, so na. Not means to remember, but you could just as legitimately translate that as to touch something, like this desk here, or to know something with absolute certainty. So when it says that they did not remember their creator in the text, you could just as easily say they did not touch their creator, or they did not know their creator with absolute certainty. It's just a choice whether you choose one or the other. It all means the same thing. This is a very powerful thing. Most of us think when we remember maybe a grandparent that has passed on, we get a picture in our mind and we just imagine what they looked like and what they sounded like. That's not the way that the Quiches look at it. When they say that they remember their grandparent, they literally call them forth from within their blood and they're present there. And so that's not just a matter of picturing them or imaging them, it's actually bringing the essence of that grandparent out of your blood to be there present and to know them with absolute certainty. So the one difference that the Quiches would say is that human beings are the only ones that have na'och, which to them means mind, knowledge, memory, intellect. Animals don't have it. Nothing else has it other than human beings. It's the one distinguishing characteristic that humans have that other living things don't. So this is a photograph that is in the archives of the Royal Geographic Society in London. And this was taken by Alfred P. Maudsley, who was working in the lake area as a photographer. Many of you know, he was doing photographs of Maya sites and Maya communities. Well, he went to Santiago Atitlan and he took this photograph of town elders sitting on the street steps of the Cabildo. And I thought this would be nice. So a friend of mine, Andrew Weeks, and I, we obtained copies, permission, and made copies of it and gave them as gifts to people in Santiago. They love old photographs, you can imagine, with the kind of worldview that they have. And I gave it to one friend of mine who was an Akbir, and he said this. I asked him, if he had ever seen this photograph before. He said, no, but look, there's Marco Huch and there's one Rohuch and over there, oh my gosh. And he was naming the people in the photograph. This is back in the 1880s. And I asked him, have you seen this photograph before? And he says, no, I didn't even know they had photographs that far back. And I said, well, how do you know them? And this is what he responded. Well, we all know them. They still visit us in dreams and in person. We know their faces. They are still very powerful, the soul of the town. The minds and their minds and their souls are pure. This is that sak, white, pure, clear. It's all the same word. This is our heritage. These people are still alive because I live. I carry their blood. I remember. They are not forgotten. And it's always that emphasis on the idea of memory. And the way he's contextualizing it is it's not just picturing them, they're part of him. So finally, we get the successful creation of mankind. And it says, it was from the places called Pashil and Kaila that the yellow ears of maize and the white ears of maize came. The newly framed and shaped people, therefore, found the food that would become their flesh. Water was their blood. It became the blood of humanity. The ears of maize entered into their flesh by means of she who has borne children and he who has begotten sons. So here's a very nice mural. Many of you have no doubt seen it in the National Museum in Mexico City. The creation of maize people, and this is taken directly from the Popol Vuh. So the gods take the maize and from the maize dough create the flesh of mankind. The difference is, though, that this is inaccurate, at least as far as the Popol Vuh is concerned, because in the text, that was completely done by the grandmother goddess, she who has borne children. And the text says, the yellow ears of maize and the white ears of maize were ground fine with 9 grindings by Ishmukhane. Food entered their flesh along with water to give them fullness, to become the fat of humanity. Thus humankind was accomplished by they who are called she who has borne children and he who has begotten sons. So notice that it has 9 grindings there. So maize is never ground dry in Maya households. It's always ground wet as a dough. So you soak the kernels overnight in a lime mixture with water to break down the hard shell around the dried maize, and it soaks and it gets nice and mushy for the next day. And then you take a handful of that, you put it on your grinding stone and you grind it. Now, usually after that first grinding, it still has lumps in it and little bits of shell and the rest. So you gather that up and you put it back as a lump onto the grinding stone and you grind it a second time. Usually for a meal, you'll grind it 3, maybe 4 times. For a ceremonial meal, you would grind it possibly 5 times. That would be as fine, as beautiful a maize as you possibly could have it. Sometimes I bring my dear wife, Janet, along with me for anthropology trips to Guatemala, because women don't talk to men about women things. So she doesn't speak Quiche or Tzigil all that well, but she does speak Spanish, and they can usually communicate enough that they can get the sense of things. Well, I was down for a fairly major ceremony, and Janet came with me. And while I was with the men, they invited the women who were grinding the maize for the ceremonial meal, invited my wife to come in and help them and participate. This is a very high honor. You generally do not have anyone other than postmenopausal, very powerful women making these ceremonial meals. and to invite my wife was really rather kind of them. So she was in there, and if you've ever seen how they make tortillas, it's magic. You know, they'll pat it for maybe 30 seconds. And in Guatemala, the tortillas are small. They're like this big around, and they're thick, and they're almost juicy. They're really delicious. And they'll pat it for 30 seconds or so, and it comes out, and it's perfectly round and perfectly even in thickness all the way across. How they do it, it's a miracle. So my wife did her very best. She took a lump of the dough and she patted it, and it probably took her 5 minutes to get it to look kind of like theirs. And there was a stack of the little tortillas that had been made for the meal. And everybody looked at my wife's tortilla, and they went on and on how beautiful it was. Oh, have you been doing this all of your life? Oh, you haven't. This is wonderful. And just when she put it onto the stack with the rest of them, one of them caught her attention, and said, oh, look at this over here. And they very quickly took her tortilla off of the stack, because it has to be perfect, and it wasn't perfect. So what this telling you, that 9 grindings, number one, Ishmokane is a moon goddess, so they're really saying 9 months. That's referring to the 9 months of human gestation to make the flesh of a human being. But it's also saying it's incredibly fine and incredibly pure and perfect. It mentions also water is what gives it fullness and blood and fat. Even today in Quiche society, if a child is slow in developing their power of speech, which is, as you can see, this is the most powerful thing that they have. Oftentimes they will take the water when they're making the dough, the maize dough. They'll occasionally dip their hand. The woman will dip their hands into a little pot of water and keep things moist. Well, eventually that little pot of water gets to be water mixed with maize dough. And this is actually kept, and it's considered to be very healthy. And if a child is slow in developing speech, they will give that child a lot of that maize water. And that's supposed to allow them to loosen their tongue and be able to speak because it has power. It's basically a sacred substance. They always say that you have to be careful, because if you give too much, they'll never shut up. So you have to be very careful about how much of that maize water you give them. So this is what it looks like. They always use a 3-stone hearth. It refers back to the 3 stones of creation. You're setting a spark in the middle of it to have that first life to emerge out of the darkness. And generally women, when they're preparing the meals for the day, they do this before dark. And so literally when they kindle the fire, they're also giving power to the sun to rise in the east. And this all sounds like it's, very spiritual and the rest, but they take this as being just the way things are. They don't think about it. They don't think that they're necessarily doing sacred things all the time. It's just the way that they have always done it. So the result of that, perfect was their sight and perfect was their knowledge. These are the first created human beings out of maize. Of everything beneath the sky. If they gazed about them, turning their faces around, they beheld that which was in the sky and that which was upon the earth. Instantly, they were able to behold everything. They didn't have to walk to see all that existed beneath the sky. They merely saw it from wherever they were. Knowledge became full. Their vision passed beyond the trees and rocks, beyond the lakes and the seas, beyond the mountains and the valleys. So this relates to modern ceremonies that, again, have their foundation in the idea of creation theology. Here's a cosmogram that this female, in this case, she's from Omostanango, has laid out a cosmogram on behalf of a client who was just entering into the 2nd trimester of pregnancy for her. And in this case, they're using the 4 cardinal directional colors on the small candles, but the larger candles are yellow, which is the color for health and abundance, sustenance. And she's also added copal, there's sugar. She's poured honey in there. Copal is incense, sweetbreads. All of these things come from living sources. Even the candles, of course, they're coming from beeswax. She's got two candles aimed towards the east in this case because dawn is the life-giving color. And so two candles gives it even more power there. And having laid out that cosmogram, she then blesses the young woman, and she'll eventually anoint that person with some of the ashes from the offering to make sure that her pregnancy goes well. So this is in pretty much all Maya languages. They don't refer to themselves as Maya very often. It's usually some version of Kaswinak. Kaswinak is the Quiche version of it. Kaswinak means true person. A true person is a maize person. No traditionalist would ever have a meal without maize because you're literally rebirthing your body with every meal. And for those that come as a tourist or visitors, they don't necessarily understand the traditions of the area. They may make mistakes in how they comport themselves. They certainly don't speak the local language. And the reason that they would have for that is that, well, they're not Kaswinak. They don't eat the local maize. So therefore they can't speak the local language. They don't understand because they don't remember the ancestral traditions, how it all fits together. So other people that come in, they may be very fine people, but they're not true people. They're bread people or wheat people or barley people or Big Mac people or Kentucky Fried Chicken people. And they may be perfectly fine people, but they're not maize people. And that explains to them a lot. If someone leaves a community and they no longer eat local maize, oftentimes people that go into the city and turn away from the old traditions, they'll dress differently, they'll forget their language, they'll forget their traditions or ignore them. And the Maya would say, well, they don't remember anymore because they're not eating maize. When I was working in a new area, oftentimes I would come in and I speak some of these languages. And when I go into a new area and pick up a conversation, hey, what's a watch, Aspano, all this kind of good stuff. And they'll stop after a few minutes and they'll say, what do you eat? And I always thought that was a very odd thing to ask. Why would what I eat? And I said, well, I suppose I eat what you eat. And they'd ask, what's that? I said, I eat maize and black beans and some gourds, things like that. And they said, that seemed to make sense to them. And finally, I went to a friend of mine and I asked him, it's the funniest thing when I pick up a conversation with somebody that knew, they oftentimes ask me what I eat. And he laughed and he said, well, it's because you speak Quiche or you speak whatever language. And I said, what does that have to do with anything? Well, you can't speak Quiche unless you eat maize because that gives you the power of speech. So all of these things fit together. So for whatever reason, it doesn't explain, the gods felt that wasn't good, that they could see everything, that their vision was perfect. So they say, what now can be done to them so that their vision reaches only nearby, so that only a little of the face of the earth can be seen by them? For it is not good what they say. Is not their existence merely framed, merely shaped? It is a mistake that they have become like gods. But if they do not multiply or are increased, when will the first planting be? When will it dawn? So they're in a dilemma because they've gone through the animals, the mud person, the wood person. None of those had the ability to have speech, that have knowledge behind it, that have memory in particular, so that there's power to their words so that they can keep the cycles of the world going. So if they destroy this group, they're made of divine flesh. There's nothing else that they can do. So it's very clever. I think the text says their eyes were merely blurred by heart of sky. They were blinded like breath upon the face of a mirror. Thus their eyes were blinded. They could see only nearby. Things were clear to them only where they were. And they would say that this is the normal state of people, that we only see nearby. We can't see beyond the mountains and the trees. However, what they would say is that under ceremonial conditions, if you are an akir and you awaken the memory of ancestral blood memory within you, then time will fold back on itself and you'll be back in that pre-blurred state and can be able to see everything. And in that state, the maize the sacred, powerful maze aspect of your being will allow you to carry out the proper ceremonies to rebirth everything. But that's only during those ceremonial conditions. For the most part, we see things only nearby. I should tell you a nice story. We're getting pretty close to the end. The importance of maize. Maize is not just food to them. It really is a powerful thing. Maya religion is an immanent religion. Most Western religions like Christianity or Islam or Judaism, monotheistic religions are transcendent, that God is far away, distant, unapproachable, to a great degree unknowable. But that's not the way that the Maya see deity. Deity, when we say the maize god, don't picture an ear of maize with a halo and wings flying around somewhere with a harp. It's maize. You tend it, you cultivate it, you love it, you consume it. It becomes part of you. There couldn't be maize without people. There couldn't be people without maize. This reciprocity is the foundation of all Maya theology. So maize is incredibly respected. And one time I was doing a dictionary back in the 1970s in the Quiche language, and was visiting one of my friends that I had as an informant. And he was really good. He and his wife actually better, knew the plants that were used for medicinal purposes and what their names were. And they were just a fountain of really good information on plants. And she was, it was early in the morning, and she was preparing the day's tortillas and tamalitos, grinding the maize on the grinding stone. And she had her little pot of soaked maize right next to her. Well, they had a little 2-year-old girl, and she was playing with mom and playing with the, she had a cute little wooden doll there that she was playing with. And the wife was really into the conversation that we had, and briefly took her eyes off of the child. And the child had reached into the pot and grabbed a handful of maize seeds and was playing with it. And some of the seeds had fallen down onto the ground. And when the mother turned around and saw what happened, she immediately took the child and placed it in her lap. And one by one, she picked up the maize kernels that had fallen onto the ground. And she wiped it off as much as she could with her finger and then with her apron, and then kissed it and apologized one by one for the disrespect that had been shown to it, and then put it back into the pot. And by the time all of those maize seeds had been restored back to its pot, she was crying, we were crying. And the last thing she did was give her daughter just this really big hug and say, we always love the maize because it is our own flesh and it is God. And that gives you a good feeling for how they look at maize. It's not food, it's sacred. So this is a nice quote when I was doing some ethnography work. This goes back to the idea that when an apich is in that ceremonial state, it's an altered state of consciousness for them. They are liminal. They have one foot in this world, one foot in the other, and they really do interact in their belief with the world of the sacred. And this is how you draw life out of that other world. And I was talking to him at one point. We were doing a ceremony, and he brought up the idea of the Spaniards when they came, and how they had destroyed many of the old ways, but not all. And this is what he said. As the old people say, when the Spaniards came, they broke off many of our branches. They even burned the trunk. But we will never die because the roots remain and they have power. We draw strength from our ancestors who live in our blood. If we as a people forget our roots, we will all die. And this will be a final thing. In 1979, I had finished pretty much the translation of the Popol Vuh. I didn't publish it for many years after that, but pretty much I'd completed the translation part. And there were some friends that I had worked with. This is in Momostenango, and I was a trained akich, and I had a number of people that I trained with and that trained me, and we were all kind of this nice group. And we got together occasionally, and I would bounce ideas, read sections of the Popol Vuh to them, and they would comment on it. And there was one elderly gentleman that loved being at those meetings. He smiled through almost all of them. but he almost never said anything. And when he did, all the younger guys would just stop doing what they were doing and listen. And I remember when we were reading that part about the ability of the first human beings to see beyond the mountains and the trees and all that. And he stood up rather than just, say something sitting. He felt this is important enough. He stood up, and this is what he said. I wonder if these words belong only to the ancient past. I think all of us passed through the various stages of creation. When we were born, we were like the animals. We could only squawk and chatter and make animal sounds. Later, we learned to say a few words, but they were words without any understanding behind them, like the mud person. I think wood people are like teenagers. They can speak, they can reproduce, but they forget who they are. They do not remember their mothers and fathers or the ancient people. They don't know their purpose in life. Wachalal, which is Quiche for my brothers, we bear a heavy, sweet burden on our backs because we remember. And because we remember, we must bear the burden of carrying out our work so that the ancestors may speak to us through our blood and our flesh. This is often very hard, but if we didn't do this, who would? Everything would be finished. Thank you.
Great presentation, Alan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone, I don't know if you have your chat feature open, but please get some questions in to Alan. And yes, we had two ladies from around Lake Atitlan tuning in.
Ooh, very nice.
One was Claire Bedard from Santa Cruz, and another lady, Karen, Karin, or Karin, from Santiago.
Oh, I know Karen.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, very well. Hi, Karen.
Maybe she wants to unmute and say hello. I had a question.
Okay, hello, Alan. I'm
Hi,
here.
it's good to hear you.
Yeah,
How are things in
nice to
Santiago?
be here. Oh, it's what to say. It's
I know.
insane as always, but it's fine.
Well, good.
Yeah, no, everything is good.
Good.
But, you know,
I'm
things are
hoping to
crazy
get down
because
this
of.
summer. We'll see.
Okay, do that. Yeah, we'll see you then. Take care.
Thanks.
I wonder if she's eating her maize and tortillas every day.
Not every day, but every so often.
And Karen Bassi says, fabulous as always.
Hi, Karen.
And I had a question. You mentioned that the Popol Vuh may have come from the east. And, we're aware of the images on Stela at Izapa with the hero twins, and at El Mirador with the images of the hero twins. And then we have the plate, I'm not sure what site it's from, of the hero twins with the rebirth of the maize god. One viewer suggested maybe at San Bartolo, but what other sites or can you think of where there are connections in the lowlands with the Popol Vuh?
Mike Coe has done an awful lot with that. He's probably the first to really identify many of these images that you see on the pottery and in the murals and all the rest of it with Popol Vuh stories. The whole idea of the maize god as creator, the primordial sea, the three mountains of creation, the darkness at the beginning of time, but particularly the hero twins in the Popol Vuh. Their names are Hunahpu and Ishpalanque, which are directly connected with the lowland versions, Hunahau and Yashpalam. So we actually see core theology dating back at least to the San Bartolo murals, which has Hunahau as being one of the creators and bloodletting and the establishment of the four cardinal directions in center, the maize god as a creator deity. All of these things resonate with what we see in the Popol Vuh. Doesn't mean that the Popol Vuh is just an illustration of lowland Maya worldview, but they share certain core ideas that all Maya share pretty much throughout their history, as far as we can tell.
Okay. And Vera Tiesler is asking, she says, wonderful presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder what role head compression boards had for the babies and their mothers, midwives, among the Quiche of the 16th century, who still shape their kids actively by using cradle boards.
Well, Vera would know better than I, but the usual explanation for using a cradle board to do cranial deformation is to make them look more like that high brow and forehead of the maize god. So it's just another way of reinforcing that connection between human beings and maize and the interconnection between the two. Does Vera have her voice on that she'd probably comment on that?
Yes, I'm here. Wonderful presentation. I really relished in everything you talked. The thing is that the Quiche and the Highland Mayas, they use the very, very primordial forms of head shaping by cradle boarding. So it's like the opposite of the maize god.
Yeah.
These are shortened and broad heads, and that's what you see still during the contact period in the post-classic. Everybody basically shaped the heads of their babies, but in a different form, different from the elongated reclined head
Yeah,
shape.
I'm more accustomed to the lowland Maya version that have the elongated heads.
Right.
That's fascinating. I have no explanation for it, but it's fascinating.
I was just wondering what your illuminated mind could comment on that, being this a female mediated practice.
Yeah,
Midwives.
it's worthless on this one.
Grandmothers.
Yeah, but you have to, grandmothers are a major element in pretty much all the Highland Maya groups. They're the midwives. Usually you don't have young midwives. They're the postmenopausal women.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And they have a patron deity in Santiago Batitlan called Yaxper, who is the patron deity of the moon goddess, of grandmothers, and of midwives. So it fits right into what we see in the lowlands with Chakchel and the midwife goddess there, midwife, elderly grandmother goddess. And it's so beautiful when they do ceremonies. And again, these are female ceremonies. So my wife tells me about these when she has her conversations. But at one point I was able to observe a midwife blessing ceremony that I wasn't supposed to see. I was sleeping in the Cofradia house and I heard some activity out in the courtyard. And at night, Cofradia houses are usually shuttered and the door is locked and closed. But the shutter was open just enough that I can kind of peek out and see. I find out later I wasn't supposed to see it. But what had happened is the midwife had taken a pail of water and timed it so that the moon, when it was full, would reach its zenith at a particular time at night. And so that pail of water, you can imagine there's no electricity or no lights. It's very, very dark. As the moon gets closer and closer to the zenith, the midwife was dipping her finger into the water of that little basin and anointing the various parts of the woman's body, beginning at the toes and working their way up to the ankles and knees. And by the time it got to the very top, which would be the top of her head, which would be the most powerful and most important anointing from that water, instead of the midwife putting her finger in the pail to get some water, she held the pregnant woman's hand herself with the finger extended and said, "And now touch the face of your grandmother." And the moon at that point was perfectly centered in the basin. And you just see the water kind of ripple back and forth away from that. It's just so beautiful. So they still have these connections between grandmothers and midwives and creation and all those other kinds of things. It's quite beautiful. As far as why they're doing brachycephalic rather than dolichocephalic, I don't know.
Maybe it's the old gods. Could that be?
Could be, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Concerning the head deformations, Karen Bassi is saying it sounds like a gourd shape, which is also the shape of Hunapu's head.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
And are there any manifestations of the maize god in the sky as a planet or the stars?
Not now. and it doesn't seem to be associated in the Popol Vuh with stars. The one astronomical thing that is kind of interesting is the belt of Orion. The three stars of in the belt of Orion are called the hearth of the sky, or the center of the sky. And hearths, of course, are the three stones of creation, and they see that as being the center of the sky, the center of where creation begins in the night sky. Sometimes we kind of get confused and say that the other world is the underworld, but that's not the way they look at it. At night, the underworld rotates above you, so that you're actually looking into Xibalba, you're looking into the other world of the sacred. And then when the sun rises again, it shifts again. So we usually prefer using the word otherworld than underworld. I wish that the Quiches said more or knew more about constellations and stars, but they don't seem to be as interested in them as probably they once were.
And let's see, Carl Calloway. Hi, Carl. Is there any indication in the creation story where the first journey or solar trek of the sun is emphasized?
As in like dawn?
You want to unmute, Carl?
Yeah, hi, Alan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Oh, again, always a joy to share in this great joy and passion for your work. And I learned something. I learned so many things every time I
Aw.
listen to you. But I've just done a little bit of research into the vase of the 7 and 11 gods. And what's really, really interesting when you dig into the iconography of those gods and those headdresses, it seems that all the gods that are represented are aspects of the solar deity. You have the god, the JGU, you have the god of the primordial sun, you have the solar deer with the hanging jaw. All of these, you have the Bolon Teku. And so it's interesting that all these gods are lined up, and they share traces of aspects of the sun, as if they're lining up the sun's path, or they're getting ready for that solar trek. And it actually happens on the base of the 11 gods. It says that it actually happens in this event is happening in this sun place, right?
Yeah.
Kinichila, which is also a classic Maya place name. So it's just really interesting. I was wondering if that first dawning of the sun, I know that there's the episode with the macaw, but
Well, yeah.
if there was any that first dawning of the sun, that first solar trek, which then gives order to the cosmos.
Oh, and that's a really cool way of putting it, because then it does resonate. So all of this creation part doesn't really talk about the sun. And in fact, when the first human beings were made, they are referred to as living in the pre-dawn era. There is no sun.
Mm.
The macaw episode with 7 macaw, the prideful macaw and all that, he's the false sun. He's dim, but at least there's some light coming off of the jewels of his teeth and his eyes and the like. But the hero twins recognize that he's a false sun. He's not the real one. If you look at the account, the first dawning of the sun doesn't take place until the first human beings migrate from the east and arrive in the Guatemalan highlands. And what's really interesting, the way that they describe it, is when that first dawn occurs, and they're the ones that facilitate it. They give offerings of blood, they give offerings of incense, they do all these things to facilitate the first dawning of the sun and give it power. But when the sun comes up, it hardens, it turns all of the previous gods to stone and gives them their place that they hold now.
Wow.
So isn't that nice?
Wow.
Like you say, is that it's ordering the sacred world in our world. I don't know how else to say.
Well, it's like that solar trek kind of brings that order because it's positions in the 4 quarters of the year, and it actually gives order to the directions of the earth as well.
Exactly.
And then the stones and the stones related to each. Wow, I'm going to have to look into that a little more.
Isn't that cool?
What a beautiful gift. Thank you.
Sure.
We've got a Giovanni Emanuel tuning in from Merida, and he's given me his email address, but if anybody is aware, he'd like to learn more about the Maya. And I know, I've got a couple friends living in Merida, but I'm not sure when David Stewart and them aren't doing their stuff. If anybody is aware of anything going on in Merida that would be learning about the Maya programs or something like that,
Does
email
Nikolai Gruba still do the workshops?
in Merida?
Yeah,
I don't know.
that'd be another one to look at.
I know Stefan Merck does a lot of research and investigations, lives there. Sid Hollander, ex-president of the IMS, lives there. A couple people I know live there, but I'm not sure. I haven't heard. I never see announcements. I get the Yucatan Today. I get various stuff about that. They want to sell the old museum, or what was the museum. They want to
Yeah.
sell that building. It's really decrepitated now.
I know Bruce Love would probably be the best one to ask. He works in that area.
All right, I'll ask Bruce. Okay, and since your publication, have you revised any of your translations?
Not of the Popol Vuh. It's in the third printing now. I'm still happy with it. So there are some things that just like typos, and I think the numbering of the literal poetic version was off at one point. I fixed those for the second edition, but it's not really revised as far as content is concerned. I just finished the title of Totonicapán English translation. It's in press now. And it's made me rethink some passages of the Popol Vuh. So if it does go into a fourth printing, then I'll probably look back at some of the areas and update it a bit. But for the most part, I'm happy with it.
Yeah.
It took me way too long. I started working in '76 and didn't publish it until 2003. I'm slow.
But it's, like I said, it's the go-to place now for scholars and researchers. I don't see
Yeah.
any more questions, but can you explain, keep me abreast of when the Totonicapán publication is released. We can announce it.
I just finished the copy editing. They've done a mock-up of the cover. I don't, publishers, especially in COVID age, it should be sometime, maybe spring.
All right. But what does that cover as different from the Popol Vuh? What's
It's a very fascinating text. It's actually at least 2 years older than it's about 2 years older than the Popol Vuh. So it's one of the earliest texts that was written at that time. And it's written in Quiche, and it's written by the dominant lineage within the Quiche nobility, like the Popol Vuh, plus a different branch of that lineage. And so it tells many of the same stories, but in some cases they kind of want to stick it in the eye of the other lineage by, in one case, one of the heroes of the Popol Vuh that goes back and brings power from the east. In the text of the Totonicapán document, he never actually went to the east. He stayed and he committed adultery with his brother's wife. And so the resultant founder of the Popol Vuh lineage is actually a bastard, and it's very fascinating for that dynamic. But it also has an entire section where Maya scholars, Quiche scholars, try to harmonize their understanding of Christianity with their theology, which really is a fascinating dynamic of how they did that. Much of it has to do with claiming authority and power based on Western traditions so that they can claim treaty rights and tribute rights and land rights and other kinds of things. Fascinating document.
And David McCormick's asking, if the old gods were turned to stone, are there particular old gods associated with different types of lithic resources?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Most of the deities that we see in the highlands are volcanic stone because it's such a volcanic area. So I don't really think that they distinguish gods based on the type of stone that they're carved out of. There are very few of them that remain because the Spanish authorities destroyed as many as they possibly could. There was one above Santiago Atitlan that was still being worshipped in the 1700s, and the priest very publicly smashed it to pieces, and it doesn't exist anymore. But from what we can tell, they just used local stone. It's the iconography, it's the motifs that they place on the carvings, I think, that distinguishes the gods rather than what material they're made of.
All right. All right, I don't see any more questions. Everybody thinks it's a great talk, terrific presentation.
Aw,
Oh, Steve is asking, who is publishing your new translation of the Titulo de Totonicapan?
University Press of Colorado.
All right.
There is a book that just came out. I didn't write the whole thing. I was a co-editor and I wrote one chapter. But if you are interested in the myths of the Popol Vuh and how they relate to archaeology, anthropology, comparative religion, and other kinds of things, this was published also by the University Press of Colorado last year. And it's co-edited by me, Holly Moyes, and Frauke Sachse.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. Thank you, Alan. Great
Thank you.
presentation. I learned a lot, and other people are saying in the chat that they learned a lot. And let's continue. And when the book is released, let's get another Aztlander and even a book release notice in the Aztlander and even the IMS Explorer newsletter. And let's go from there. So thank you, everybody. And stay tuned for Aztlander recording announcements and our February and March presentations. Thank you once again, Alan.
Thank you so much.
All righty.
Have a good evening.
Take care.